Welcome to the Deep Dive. Today we're plunging into, well, a big one, Immanuel Kant's critique of judgment.
It's definitely a challenge, yeah. But so rewarding. This is Kant's third critique, and it's where he tries to sort of connect the dots, right, between his theory of knowledge and his moral philosophy.
Exactly. Connecting how we understand the world out there scientifically and how we understand ourselves as moral actors within it.
And it tackles all those things that don't quite fit neatly into science or morality, like, why we find things beautiful, what art is doing, why nature sometimes looks designed.
Right. And the source material we're using today acts as a guide, really. It pulls out the key bits, gives some commentary. So our mission here isn't just to give you a book report.
No, definitely
We
not.
want to really dig in, extract the core ideas, and see what they tell us about how we experience things, how we judge beauty, or feel overwhelmed by the sublime, and how we search for purpose.
And we should probably give that fair warning up front. Kant is dense.
He is. The source notes this too. Very technical, sometimes feels repetitive.
Yeah, those fine-grained distinctions can feel slow-going, but honestly, stick with it, because getting why he makes them, well, it unlocks some really profound ways of thinking about experience, creativity, even meaning itself.
Okay, so we'll be covering a few key areas. First, aesthetic judgment, the beautiful, the sublime.
Then how we produce beauty, genius, and art.
And finally, teleological judgment, thinking about purpose in nature and how that all loops back to morality and maybe even the idea of God.
It's quite a journey, as you said.
It really is. So where do we start? That fundamental question about judging beauty.
Yeah, let's start right there. Aesthetic judgment, beginning with the beautiful. So when Kant talks about a judgment of taste, what's the absolute core idea?
It's aesthetic, right? Meaning it's based on a feeling.
Exactly, a feeling of pleasure. And this is crucial, it's not based on knowing facts or concepts about the thing itself.
So I don't look at a flower and say, beautiful, because it has 5 petals and perfect symmetry based on botanical principles.
Precisely. You look at it and it evokes this particular feeling. And the source really hammers this point. The feeling is pleasure without any interest.
Okay, without interest.
Yeah.
That sounds counterintuitive. If I like something, surely I'm interested in it.
But interest for Kant has a very specific meaning here. It means having a stake in the thing existing, or being useful, or fulfilling some kind of purpose for you.
Okay. Give me an example.
Well, think about enjoying a really great meal. You're interested in the food existing so you can eat it, right? It satisfies a desire. That's interest.
Or like a really well-made hammer. I like it because it's good for hammering nails. It serves a purpose. That's interest too.
Exactly. You have an interest in its utility. The pleasure in beauty, though, is different. It's not about wanting to use the beautiful object or possess it, or even admiring it because it perfectly fulfills some concept, like perfect specimen of a rose.
So the pleasure comes just from looking at it or hearing it.
Pretty much. The source says it comes from the mere representation of the object. How it appears to your mind, the form of it, regardless of whether it's real or useful or fits a category. It's a kind of subjective purposiveness. It feels like it's made for our minds to grasp, even if there's no actual designer or purpose behind it.
That sounds incredibly subjective, though. I like how this looks. But Kant, and our source highlights this, says these judgments of taste claim universal validity. How does that work? How can I say this is beautiful and expect everyone else ought to agree?
Right, that's the really clever bit, because the pleasure isn't tied to my personal tastes or needs or interests, the things that make us different. Kant argues it must stem from something we all share as thinking beings.
Our basic cognitive machinery.
Kind of, yeah. He says the feeling arises from the free play between our imagination and our understanding. When they encounter a beautiful form, they just sort of harmonize perfectly. And since we all presumably have imagination and understanding wired up in a similar way,
We should all, ideally, experience that same harmonious play, that same pleasure.
that's the basis for the claim. It's why you can say, this is beautiful, not just, I like this. You're implying everyone ought to feel this way. It's subjective, because it's your feeling, but it demands universality because it's grounded in our shared cognitive structure.
And this leads to his idea of common sense. Not like practical wisdom, but...
Right, a different kind of common sense. An ideal standard, a shared norm for how our subjective judgments should operate when it comes to beauty. It's the assumption that allows us to make that universal claim.
Okay. He also makes this distinction that seems important. Free beauty versus adherent beauty.
Yes, and this really helps clarify that without interest point. Free beauty is judged purely on form, with no concept of what the thing is supposed to be.
Like abstract patterns you mentioned.
Exactly. Arabesques, music without lyrics, maybe some flowers or seashells. You just appreciate the form itself. There's no concept of what it's for getting in the way.
Inherent beauty.
That's when you do have a concept of the object's purpose or perfection. Think of the beauty of a person or a horse or a church. You judge these partly based on how well they fulfill their concept. Is it a good example of a church or a horse?
So your judgment isn't purely aesthetic anymore. It's mixed with a concept.
Right. According to the source, judging adherent beauty involves considering the object's perfection relative to its concept, so it's not a pure judgment of taste in Kant's strictest sense.
So the pure judgment, the one that really reveals the core mechanism, is based on free beauty. It's all about the form.
Exactly. The source emphasizes form, not just, pleasing colors or emotional associations, though those can be added on. The core pleasure is from how the form itself seems purposive for our minds, even without an actual purpose.
Okay, that makes sense of how we judge beauty. What about making it? Let's shift gears to genius and art.
Right. So if taste is about judging, genius is about producing beautiful art. Kant defines genius as the talent, the innate ability that gives the rule to art.
But crucially, not a rule you can just learn from a textbook, right?
Precisely. The source says it's like nature giving the rule through the artist. It's original, it's exemplary, it sets a new standard, but the artist can't fully explain how they did it in a way that someone else could just copy step by step. It's an innate gift.
Like the old saying, a poet is born, not made.
Yeah, the source mentions that and applies it to all fine art. And what genius produces specifically are aesthetical ideas.
Aesthetical ideas.
Okay.
What are those exactly? The source calls them intuitions of the imagination so rich, no concept can fully capture them. That sounds big.
It is a bit abstract, yeah. Think about it like this. You experience a really powerful piece of music, or a poem, or a painting. The artist takes some kind of rational idea, maybe love, or death, or freedom, but presents it through the imagination with such a wealth of feeling, imagery, and association that no single definition or concept can possibly exhaust its meaning.
So it sparks way more thought and feeling than just stating the concept.
Exactly. It gets the imagination going, suggesting more than can be neatly said. The source notes it's like the imagination trying to present something boundless, something akin to what reason deals with, but doing it through sensory forms. Poetry is a great example.
Okay, so genius brings this rich, almost uncontainable spirit or soul to the artwork. How does taste fit in with genius?
Taste is the necessary partner. Maybe think of genius as the wild energy, and taste as the discipline that shapes it. Genius provides the powerful aesthetical ideas, the content. Taste judges whether that content is presented in a form that's harmonious, well-judged, and suitable for universal appreciation, basically, whether it works as beautiful art.
So you need both.
Absolutely. Art needs the spirit from genius to be compelling and alive, but it needs the form and control of taste to be truly beautiful and communicate effectively. Otherwise, it might just be, original, but messy or bizarre.
The source mentions Kant's classification of arts, too.
Yeah, briefly. He groups them by medium: arts of speech, like poetry, formative arts, like sculpture and painting, using visual forms, and then arts playing with sensations, like music. The source highlights Kant's interesting view of music as almost a language of emotions, stirring up aesthetic ideas through associations.
And there was a connection to morality again.
Yes, a really important point the source brings out. Kant suggests that beautiful art finds its highest value, its most lasting satisfaction, when it connects with moral ideas. When art elevates the soul, so to speak, otherwise it risks just being pleasant distraction, mere enjoyment, which doesn't offer that deeper sense of fulfillment.
Interesting. So beauty seems to gently nudge us towards the moral sphere. But what about experiences that aren't gentle or pleasing at all? Let's talk about the sublime.
Ah, yes, the sublime. Very different from the beautiful, though both are aesthetic judgments based on feeling, involving reflection.
Okay, so what's the key difference in the feeling?
Well, the beautiful is about form and harmony. It feels life-enhancing, and it can have charm. The sublime arises from formlessness, or things that seem to overwhelm form specifically, immense magnitude, which gives us the mathematical sublime or overwhelming might, the dynamical sublime.
The feeling isn't just pleasure.
No, it often starts with a kind of shock or check to our faculties, almost a displeasure or pain, followed by a powerful surge of vitality. It feels more serious, like awe or respect. The source calls it a negative pleasure, pleasure that arises through that initial feeling of limitation or fear. And it's definitely not about charm.
And Critically, the source emphasizes the sublime feeling isn't in the mountain or the storm.
Absolutely crucial. It's in the mind. Nature is just the trigger. The sublime object in nature might even seem chaotic, formless, purposeless, doing violence to the imagination, as the source puts it. The sublimity is our response to that.
Okay, let's break down the two types. Mathematical first, vastness.
Right. Think of staring up at the night sky, or looking out over a huge mountain range or the ocean. Things so vast our imagination struggles to grasp them as a single whole, to take in their totality in one go. We try to measure them, apprehend them, and our sensible faculty, imagination, just fails.
And that failure is the first step, that pain.
Yes, but here's the twist. That very failure makes us aware of another faculty we have, reason. Reason can think the infinite, can conceive of totality, concepts that go beyond anything our senses or imagination can measure or picture.
Ah, so the feeling of the sublime comes from realizing our mind's power, even as our imagination hits a wall.
Exactly. The pleasure isn't in the vast object itself, but in this dawning awareness of our own rational capacity, our supersensible side that transcends the limits of the physical world. It's pleasure through the pain of the imagination's inadequacy.
Got it. Okay, what about the dynamical sublime? That's about power, might.
Yes. Think volcanoes, hurricanes, huge waterfalls, thunderclouds, nature displaying immense power. But the key condition, stressed by the source, is that we have to perceive this power without being afraid of it. We need to be in a position of safety.
So watching the storm from a safe distance, not being caught in it.
Right. Because if you're genuinely terrified, that's just fear. But if you're safe, witnessing that overwhelming power makes you aware of a different kind of power, or rather, a resistance within yourself. You realize that your own rational will, your moral self, can stand firm against nature's might. You have a capacity for reason and morality that nature's brute force can't touch.
So it's a feeling of our own inner strength and freedom in the face of external power.
Precisely. A feeling of respect for our own rational and moral vocation, which is seen as superior to physical nature. The source even mentions Kant's controversial example of war when conducted with order and principle. He suggests it can evoke the sublime by displaying courage, discipline, the overcoming of fear, contrasting this with the supposed effeminacy of long peace. A notable point from the source, presented impartially here.
And like the beautiful, this judgment of the sublime also claims universal validity.
Yes, for similar reasons. The feeling arises from the interplay between imagination and reason instead of understanding for beauty, and it relies on our having these rational ideas and, importantly, a capacity for moral feeling, which Kant assumes is common to all humans. So we feel entitled to expect others should feel this way too, given the right circumstances and the necessary mental cultivation.
Okay, we've covered aesthetic judgment feelings about beauty and the sublime. Now let's switch tracks to teleological judgment. This is about seeing purpose in nature.
Exactly. We're shifting from how nature makes us feel aesthetically to how we think about nature, specifically when it looks like it's organized or designed with a purpose.
What's the basic problem Kant's wrestling with here?
It's that fundamental tension. On one hand, science, especially in Kant's time, was moving towards explaining everything mechanistically, just cause and effect, like billiard balls colliding. No need for purpose.
But then you look at a bird or a tree.
Right. And they just seem incredibly organized.
Yeah.
The parts work together for the sake of the whole organism, for survival, for reproduction. It looks like design. Our understanding, Kant says, and the source echoes this, is discursive. We understand things by analyzing parts and building up. We struggle to grasp the whole of an organism all at once, the way maybe an intuitive understanding could. So explaining a living thing purely by mechanism feels incomplete.
And the source mentioned Kant positing some kind of supersensible ground where these two views might reconcile.
Yeah, it's a bit speculative, but it's his way of saying maybe reality itself isn't divided this way. Maybe there's some deeper level beyond our senses where the mechanistic chain of causes and the apparent purposiveness are somehow united. But we can't know that ground directly. We just have to work with how our minds make sense of things.
So when we talk about the purposiveness of nature, we're not saying nature objectively has purposes.
Not necessarily. It's a concept we use in our reflective judgment. That's the part of our mind that looks at particular things we observe and tries to find general principles or laws for them. When nature looks orderly, systematic, especially when it seems organized in a way that our minds can easily grasp, we represent it as if an intelligent mind had designed it that way. It's a necessary assumption for us to make sense of it.
The source drew some distinctions here, formal versus material purposiveness.
Right. Formal purposiveness is like the inherent elegance in geometry, it seems, right? But isn't about external goals. Then there's external usefulness, like pine trees are useful to us for wood, but Kant doesn't see our use as the tree's natural purpose.
The really important one is internal purposiveness, what he calls natural purposes.
Yes, and this is all about living organisms. What makes something a natural purpose? The source really highlights this. Its parts are reciprocally cause and effect of each other's form.
How's that different from, say, a complex machine like a watch?
Well, in a watch, the spring makes the gears turn, which move the hands. There's a chain of cause and effect for the purpose of telling time. But the spring doesn't create the gear. The parts don't generate each other.
Ah, but in a plant.
The leaves perform photosynthesis, which feeds the whole plant, including the roots. The roots anchor the plant and draw water, allowing the leaves to exist and function. Each part exists for the others in the whole, but it also actively produces and maintains the other parts. And the organism can reproduce itself. It's self-organizing, self-maintaining, self-generating in a way a machine isn't.
And we find it impossible to explain that just with mechanism.
For Kant, our kind of understanding struggles immensely with it. So the concept of a natural purpose becomes a necessary maxim for our judgment, as the source puts it. We have to think about organisms this way to even begin studying them properly. But it's a regulative principle. It guides our research, helps us ask the right questions. It's not constitutive. It doesn't claim to describe the ultimate reality of how that organism came to be, just how we must approach understanding it.
Like needing a map to navigate a city, even if the map doesn't explain the physics of the buildings.
That's a great analogy. The teleological concept is like the map, essential for our navigation of the complexities of life, even if the ultimate physics might be purely mechanistic or something else entirely beyond our grasp.
But this creates a tension, right? Explain everything by mechanism versus we need purpose to explain life.
Exactly. That's the antinomy of teleological judgment. You have one maxim saying, explain everything mechanistically, and another saying, some things, i.e. organisms, require teleological principles. They seem contradictory.
How does Kant resolve it?
The source notes his resolution involves arguing that these maxims apply to different modes of judgment, determinate versus reflective, and don't necessarily contradict each other at the level of ultimate reality, that unknown inner ground of nature. For us, however, mechanistic explanation alone seems insufficient for organized beings.
Okay, so thinking about life pushes us towards thinking about purpose or design, which naturally leads to the idea of a designer.
It does. This is where the teleological argument, the classic design argument, comes in. You see apparent design in nature, especially in complex life forms, and you infer an intelligent designer. The source acknowledges this argument has huge intuitive appeal. It feels like it explains things neatly.
But Kant is critical of it as a proof of God.
Very much so. While acknowledging its power for common understanding, he argues that from a strict philosophical, speculative viewpoint, it doesn't work as a logical proof. The source explains. You can't rigorously leap from observing finite, conditioned purposiveness within the world to proving a single, infinite, unconditioned, intelligent creator outside the world. It's an analogy that works for our judgment. It helps us make sense of things, but it's not a deductive proof. It remains subjectively useful, not objectively demonstrated.
Okay, so if nature seems purposive but doesn't prove a designer, does Kant think nature has an ultimate purpose?
He explores this idea. If we're going to think of the whole system of nature as having some final end, the source says Kant identifies this ultimate purpose within nature as relating to man.
But not just humans being clever and using nature.
No, not primarily. It has to be something that is an end in itself, not just a means to something else. And for Kant, that can only be man as a moral being.
Why morality?
Because, according to the source, only humans, through reason, can conceive of and act according to universal laws, the moral law. Only we can set purposes that are unconditioned, rooted in rationality itself. Humanity, understood as this capacity for rational freedom and morality, is the only thing in the world that seems to have intrinsic, unconditioned worth, capable of being an ultimate purpose for which nature could be seen as existing.
So things like happiness or human skill aren't the ultimate end.
They're important, but secondary or conditioned, as the source puts it. Happiness, for Kant, is only truly good when combined with the worthiness to be happy, which comes from acting morally. So morality is fundamental.
Okay, so the idea of an ultimate moral purpose arises. How does this connect back to the idea of God if the design argument isn't a proof?
This is where Kant's famous moral argument comes in, which the source outlines. It's not about proving God exists as a theoretical fact. It's about what practical reason, as it guides our actions, requires us to postulate or assume.
What does practical reason require?
Well, morality commands us to strive for the highest good. For Kant, this means a world where perfect virtue is eventually matched by proportionate happiness. We have a duty to work towards this. But looking around, we see no guarantee in the natural world that being virtuous leads to happiness.
Right, often quite the opposite.
Exactly. So for our striving for the highest good to make rational sense, for it to be conceivable that this goal is actually possible, practical reason needs to assume the existence of a moral author of the world, God, who has the power and the will to eventually bring virtue and happiness into alignment.
So we don't know God exists, but we have to believe it for morality to make ultimate sense.
That's the essence of it. It's a postulate, a necessary assumption from the practical point of view. It gives us hope and makes rational our commitment to the moral law and its final purpose. The source calls this moral faith.
Moral faith. So it's not knowledge, not blind faith, but a rational faith grounded in our moral experience.
Precisely. It's an attitude of reason stemming from the demands of our moral life. The source notes this helps Kant avoid dogmatic claims about knowing God, fanaticism, or reducing God to something human-like, anthropomorphism. The focus is on what the idea of God does for our practical moral orientation in the world.
Okay, let's try and tie these threads together like the source suggests. We've got aesthetic judgment, beauty, sublime, artistic creation, genius, teleological judgment, purpose in nature, and now morality and this moral faith. How do they all connect in Kant's system?
The connections are subtle but crucial, mostly running through our reflective judgment and pointing towards the moral sphere. Beauty, for instance, the source reminds us, Kant calls a symbol of morality.
A symbol, how so?
There's an analogy in the structure of the judgment. Judging beauty involves that free, disinterested pleasure based on a feeling of harmony. We expect everyone to share it. It feels subjectively universal, like following a law without a specific concept. Moral judgment involves acting freely according to the universal moral law, out of respect, not personal interest. So appreciating beauty kind of exercises the mind in making disinterested, universally minded judgments, preparing us for moral thinking.
Okay, that's interesting. And the sublime.
That connection's even more direct. The feeling of the sublime, that awe in the face of immensity or power, directly evokes our awareness of our own rational, supersensible nature, our capacity to think beyond the physical, and our inner strength grounded in moral ideas. It points right at the dignity of our rational and moral selves.
And then teleological judgment, seeing purpose in nature.
That whole line of thought leads us, as we saw, to consider an ultimate purpose for nature, which Kant locates in humanity as a moral subject. And then, realizing the conditions needed to make that ultimate moral purpose, the highest good possible, leads us to the postulate of God, required by practical reason.
So it all seems to funnel towards the primacy of the moral.
In a way, yes. The critique of judgment acts as a bridge. Our aesthetic experiences and our way of thinking about purpose in nature, while not giving us theoretical knowledge of God or the soul, sort of prepare the ground, provide hints and symbols, and ultimately reveal needs within our reason that only the moral perspective and the postulates required by it can satisfy.
So wrapping this up, our deep dive into Kant's critique of judgment really shows how our feelings about beauty, our awe at the sublime, even the way we instinctively look for purpose in the world, these aren't just random reactions.
No, they're deeply tied into the very structure of how our minds work. Imagination, understanding, reason, all interacting. It suggests appreciating beauty trains us for a kind of disinterested perspective, hinting at universality.
While the sublime shocks us into realizing the power of our own reason and moral capacity, even when nature seems overwhelming.
Exactly. And then wrestling with the apparent design in life nudges us towards thinking about ultimate purposes, which Kant anchors firmly in our existence as moral beings, leading practical reason to postulate what's needed to make sense of that moral calling.
It's definitely complex, intricate stuff, but
Yeah.
working through it really does change how you think about taste, art, science, and maybe the possibility of meaning itself.
It really does. It's a profound exploration of the human condition.
So here's a final thought to leave you with, drawing from what we've explored today. Think about that feeling when you find something in nature truly beautiful. A sunset, a forest, a flower. Kant suggests this feeling involves perceiving a kind of purposiveness, as if it were designed for our minds. even if we intellectually know it might be the result of chance or natural laws. If that feeling is so fundamental, what does it tell us about ourselves? About maybe an innate human need to find not just order, but meaning and resonance in the world around us, rather than seeing it as just, mechanisms and matter, something to ponder.